Clive Sullivan broke barriers and bridged gaps.
Now for Dublin getting the pass into Clive Sullivan and a try, the first try of the match.
He was the first black captain of a British national team.
Everybody's saying go, 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 and he goes for a try to Sullivan.
He won the World Cup.
A boy from South Wales.
He achieved fame in Hull.
A Super League city with two teams.
East and West.
Red and white.
And black and white.
He had such an impact on the city.
The road that leads into Hull is named in his honour.
In an era that was fraught with racial and social tension, Clive was a beacon of unity.
A pioneer in the cultural history of British sport.
He was fast.
The crowd loved him.
I've heard the rumours how Sully left people for dead. Left them for dead. He was that quick. It was unbelievable.
He was so exciting. And anybody with speed and who scores spectacular tries is always revered by the many. And Clive was a gem.
Clive Sullivan making it 8 points to 4.
Clive Sullivan had been born in Cardiff, and he was of a generation of black rugby players who realised that they had to go north to fulfil their full potential. Many Welsh players realised that they wouldn't be able to play at the highest levels in rugby union because at that time it was an open secret that black players wouldn't play international rugby union for Wales. And Clive had seen the example of Roy Francis and particularly Billy Boston, and he wanted to go and play rugby league. He knew that's where his future lay. And he was signed by Roy Francis at Hull.
The original story of Clive Sullivan is that he was in the army. The club rang the army. I think he was in Wales at the time, and about him coming for a trial. And Hull were playing Batley that particular day, and I was captain of the team at the time. From the minute he touched the ball, he was electric, and he scored 2 blistering tries. He just zoomed, But at half time, the chairman, our chairman, Mr. Hardacre, said, "Johnny, when the game finishes, for goodness sake, get hold of Clive and bring him straight into the boardroom." But by the time we'd finished, Mr. Hardacre called me in the boardroom and said, "We've signed Clive, we've signed him on a contract." And he just went from success to success.
When Clive Sullivan was made captain of Great Britain in 1972, in hindsight, when we look back, this was a great historic moment. There's 2 things that are interesting. One, that in rugby league, this was just seen as natural. Nobody in rugby league said this is unusual or this is unexpected. Everybody knew that Clive was a great man to do the job, and there was no discussion about the colour of his skin. He was accepted as the leader, and that's a very important point. On the other hand, in British society, there wasn't much notice taken of this. It wasn't seen as a great leap forward that it should have been in terms of integration.
Like they'd won, and it was like the biggest thing I could imagine, and yet there was the papers didn't make anything of it. When they landed, there was no reception committee. And I remember he walked in and he had the World Cup in his hands, and then he went to work on the Monday.
It's a little bit like Vincent van Gogh. I think Van Gogh painted a lot of pictures, and at the time, I think in his lifetime, he only sold 1 painting and probably died not realising how important he was, that he was a genius in many ways and so iconic. And at the time, we probably didn't celebrate that enough. And certainly with 2020 and some of the political and cultural issues we've got going on at the minute, I think it only serves to highlight how important Clive Sullivan was in his journey and his achievements, and ultimately the legacy that is left behind. And we need to underline that, we need to frame that and tell the story, because it's still got so much value left to give.
Sullivan,
Is they trying it?
Can he go? I think Sullivan will go.
Oh my word. Look at that sidestep as well.
Let him go.
They'll not catch him. See you later.
For a try to Sullivan.
Wow. Wow.
The knock-on effect or the legacy that he might have had would be to have encouraged other black players and multi-ethnic players to take up the sport. Having graced the field himself, I look at players like Desi Drummond and Ellery Hanley and Martin Offiah and some of the guys that I watched Henderson Gill doing the boogie against the Aussies. Certainly, brings back memories of when I was a young kid and reasons why I wanted to pick up a rugby ball and go out and play. But I'll say this again, that it wasn't necessarily anything to do with their colours. Who were just great players.
Growing up, you want to be like them. Players like him. As a winger as well, being a winger myself, I just wanted to emulate or get somewhere near as to how he was. Players like him, they don't come along all the time, and there's something special. Growing up in that era as well, it can't have been easy because I knew what it was like growing up in the 70s myself and the 80s. You got a lot of stick as well, from the general public as well and things like that. So it must have been very, very hard for them. And that's why I always say players like them paved the ways for players like me, myself, and all the others that came along after me.
It's really inspiring what he's done on the field and also off the field, how he carried himself. Obviously, back in his time, things would have been worse, with racism and that, and racial tensions. And he's described as being a gentleman off the field also.
Obviously, with him leading a team, leading the country, in his sport and being the first black player to do that, I think obviously that inspired a lot of black players that were interested in wanting to get into rugby league or in any kind of sport. That was the main thing, and knowing that he could achieve the goals that he wanted to achieve.
In our day, to some extent, we were illiterate to what the world was about, really. We had Eastall and we had Westall, and Westall was the fishing community, and we were very, very tight-knit. And so, really, the politics in case of black and white never ever, in my opinion, because again, in sport, when people are involved in sport, by and large, you're a team outfit, and it doesn't matter what you come from. Once you wear a shirt, it doesn't matter you're a millionaire or you're a pauper. You're a rugby player or whatever. And so the same thing applies to black and white.
And so in 1895, when the clubs broke away from the rugby union, it was over the question of the equal treatment of all players that the northern clubs said, you shouldn't be disadvantaged if you work 5 days a week in a factory or down the mine. It's again based on equality of opportunity, that the only thing that matters is how you perform on the pitch. It doesn't matter what school you went to, what university you went to, what job you do, what your status is or what colour of your skin is. It's all down to equality of opportunity on the pitch.
I think there's no bigger rivalry in rugby league. Hull FC and Hull KR, the biggest rivalry, the biggest derby, many would argue.
If you support one or the other growing up, you also grow up learning to hate the other side, and that's just how it is. Then, like I said, I love playing for LKR now, and I love the fans, and I love this side of the city. But as a kid growing up as an FC fan, you get brought up black and white's the only way. You never wear red and white. You never support red and white, and that's just how it is.
Because we live in the west of the city and Rovers are in the east of the city, the majority of people who lived around us were all FC supporters. And he got quite a few comments to start with, and there was an incident where they decided they would paint his car. And when all came to all and we got down there, it was painted with tomato ketchup. Then it settled down, and since he's died, I think the Hull FC supporters are still proud that he played for them and broke records for them. He's well thought of across the city, and Clive loved Hull, coming from Cardiff, and he loved the Hull people. He got on with them really well. Very, very proud of being Welsh, but he was adopted by Hull.
Whilst you look at it as rivalry and division, actually, Clive Sullivan way brings them together. What an almost poetic way of doing it.
He became part of the structure, of the infrastructure of the city, really, and it was easy for him to say, well, let's name the road after Clive. He'd connected Eastall to Westall through his football skills, and also his persona.
He's one of a few people that I think epitomises both sides of the city. He's been a fantastic ambassador for the city and for the sport of rugby league as well. And I think that, you know, when we lost him in, I think it was 85, you know, it was a massive dent for both sides, for both clubs on both sides of the city, and certainly for me personally, you know, I felt it quite a lot. It was, you know, it was like somebody had taken somebody away from you that at the time you probably didn't want to. So as time goes by, I think Clive will always be remembered for the person that overcome the divide of the racism and the culture that he did. You know, he epitomised the modern day athlete.
In an age where diversity is so important, that it's somebody like Clive who's the iconic picture, the symbol of pulling people together rather than separating them, keeping them apart. So I think it's really special.
Clive was my husband, he was dad to my two children, Anthony and Lisa. He could be really good fun. He had time for everyone. He was modest, and he would be amazed at the impact he has had. Not only in Hull, sort of me sitting here today and speaking about him. It's 35 years since his death. He would be really, really amazed, as we are. You know, because to us he was Clive. He was my husband, he was Anthony and Lisa's dad. We haven't realised. It's only now when I look back and read what he actually achieved. He achieved a lot in a short time.